I want to demonstrate how to do source level debugging in VS Code of your user interface code in Vue. And I'm just following basically a tutorial that's available on the Vue site that talks about how to do this. There's also resources at the VS Code site. And this is just one example of how to use an IDE to do source level debugging. There's other platforms that also support this. The JetBrains tools do. So if you're using WebStorm, you can find the documentation about how to set up a similar configuration in there. According to the setup instructions, which I'll link to from the website, there is some configuration things that you've got to do to make this work properly. So this example code here is basically just the UI single page application code that we've been working with. And here in Vue.config.js, you have to make some changes here to tell Webpack how to set things up so that the development tooling can access the source code. You don't really have to go into detail about what that is doing exactly, and I'll update the Git repository to have all this same configuration so you don't have to monkey with it. The other thing that we need to do when we're using the debugger in VS Code, so here's my .vs code directory, which will also be pushed to GitHub. There's a launch.json configuration file that tells VS Code how to start up an external program. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to start up our servers, both the API server and the user interface server that runs the Vue CLI service. And those will be running in the background. And then when we want to actually launch the application in the browser, we're going to do that through VS Code, so that VS Code basically has a way of accessing the runtime as it's executing. So in order to tell it how to do that, how to launch the application, we've got to provide this configuration data. So in the configurations list, we tell it this is a configuration for Chrome or a Chrome-based browser. I actually use Brave right now, which is Chrome-based and works just fine. Chrome itself, of course, would work. There's also configurations available for Firefox if you're using that family of browsers. And what we're going to do is launch something new. We give it a name, and we'll see that Vue.JS Chrome is going to show up in a second. We tell it what we want to have it connect to, and you'll notice that the URL here is that of the user interface CLI service program. So in the past, you've been starting up the user interface server and going to the URL that it tells you about. Here we're just configuring VS Code to know what that URL is, and then when we start up the program, the user interface through VS Code, it'll go there to get started. And then there's some other details about how to get this thing set up. Again, this will be pushed to GitHub, so you can just kind of download it and use it. All right, so the first thing we want to do here is fire up our servers. So I'm going to just use the built-in terminal mode inside of VS Code. We need two terminals, so I kind of like to see both of them operating at once. And over here I'm going to run yarn UI watch, and that'll start up the UI server, and over here yarn API watch, which will start up the happy API. Now once those things are executing, of course the happy API is basically just going to do what it's always doing, just serving requests. But again, on the user interface side, we would normally point our browser at this URL. What we're going to do instead, as I mentioned, is point VS Code at that same URL, which is where what we configured up here in the launch.json file. This is called source level debugging. So instead of putting console.log statements or what is generically called printf debugging inside of our code and looking at a console, we actually want to be able to access the source code as we're debugging. And I'm going to just illustrate that really quickly here by opening up the sign up page. So this is the page that lets you add a new account to this little application. And what we can do from in the source code here, you've probably seen this little column that shows the red dots here. That allows you to set a breakpoint. And a breakpoint basically tells the runtime environment, when you're about to execute this instruction, just stop for a second and let the programmer take a look at the state of the program as it currently is at that moment. So we're going to just put one breakpoint in here really simply, and you just kind of point to the line you want to break at and click the left mouse button, and it sets that breakpoint with a little red spot. And if we go into our debugger in VS Code, we can see down here at the bottom of the page it's showing us the breakpoints, and this one that we just added in signup.vue line 117 is currently active. So what's going to happen here is when we run the code and then navigate to this signup page, VS Code is going to stop the execution of that Vue code in our browser and let us examine it and change it and single step through it and that kind of stuff. So the next thing to do then is to actually start up the browser. And we've got some options here at the top of the debug page. We can choose different kind of debug configurations. The one that we want is via Vue.js Chrome that we just set up. And then we just hit the run button here. And after a second, you'll see that we're launching Chrome, and it's being told to navigate to that localhost 8080, which is the main page or the main location where the Vue code is going to be served to us. Now I can go through here and do various things like click the sign in page, click the about us page, and nothing unusual is happening. However, because I set a breakpoint over here in my code, when I try to run this function as a result of clicking through the sign up page, we'll see that the debugger takes over. So I'm going to open up the sign up page, and I'm going to add myself. Now, as soon as I click sign up, immediately we get bounced back over into VS Code, and you can see now that that little breakpoint indicator has been surrounded by this sort of position indication that says the code is currently stopped at this location in the Vue code. And this again is coming from the signup.vue code itself. And once we're here, we can now kind of poke around and examine what's happening. So for example, we can look at the value for account created, and the little pop-up shows us that it's false. We can also look, for example, at the new member structure, which is got the information that we've retrieved from the form. And this is a little bit more elaborate here because there's these different getters and setters from the JavaScript. But if we want to just inspect it simply, we can just hover over first name, last name, email, password, right? The things that I just typed in from the form. So it allows you to examine the current state of your program right on the fly here. So let's set another breakpoint down here inside of the then method that should be called. So this is a function, a fat arrow function that should be called in the event that the post request to our server is successful. And I'm going to, so up here in the right hand side, once the debugger is under control, you get this little toolbar that lets you control the debugger. So you can hit the triangle here, and you see it says continue. That's just going to restart the execution of the program from the point where it was last stopped at a breakpoint. And it will keep running until it hits another breakpoint, if you have one set, or it'll just keep running normally for the rest of the execution of the UI. You can also do some single stepping. So there's a step over and a step into. The difference between those things is that step over will step over procedure calls. So if you're positioned in the code at a point where you're about to make a function call or a method call, step over will make that call and just step you to the next line in the current file that you're looking at, which is oftentimes what you want to do because you might just be looking at the control flow at a particular level of the procedure call hierarchy, and you don't really want to look in more detail at what's being called. On the other hand, if you do want to descend into those function or method calls, you can use step into, and that will take you to that next level down. There's also a step out of, which basically says run the current function until it returns and then break. And then there's a restart. So if you want to just start over from scratch at the very beginning of the execution of this code, you can do that. And then you can also stop the debugger if you're done working with it. So what I'm going to do here, just to illustrate how this works, is I'm going to click the step over, and you want to keep an eye down here on the currently highlighted line of code. So I'm going to hit step over, and you see that we've advanced now There's a big pop-up. Advance now to the next executable in the source of the application. And that's what we mean by source level debugging, right? We're looking at the actual source code, and the debugging environment is helping us by letting us single step and do other things through the code at this level. We can also just let the execution run until the next breakpoint, and I've already set a breakpoint down here that will be triggered if we successfully submit this new account, and I'm going to now hit the continue button. And what happens is, well, we successfully sent this message to the server, and we got some information back from it, and now we've broken at the location where we're trying to interpret the results that we got back from the server. So we can again kind of hover here and inspect the data that we're interested in. So here's the data content of that return value, and we can see that there was a message return that says, hey, we successfully created that account, and the OK flag was set to true. So if we, because this is a true value, because we got a successful conclusion to the add of that new account, if we hit step over, we'll go into the if statement itself. And you can see that we've now advanced to the next line, and that line is going to call show dialog. Well, we know that that's a pretty simple function here, but let's step into it just to see how that works. So we'll do step in, and now we find ourselves inside the show dialog function. If instead we had chosen step over, it would have called show dialog, but we wouldn't have broken inside of show dialog. And now we can step through this as we see fit until it gets to the end, and then it returns, and then we'll find ourselves back up here at the next line of the source code beyond the invocation of that show dialog function. We can also, as we saw before, we can look at the other details of this result object that came back. You can also use this view over here in the sidebar that lets you kind of drill down into this thing a little bit more specifically. So if I'm just interested in the message value or the OK value, or if I want to look at the headers that came back from the server, or if I want to look at the details of the request, right? All that information is available to me. Here's the status code when we return a status value on the server. In this case, a 200 OK code. We can actually see that information coming back from the server. So not only can you look at the details of your code, but you can also see the details of the data that's being transmitted back and forth. There's another video that talks about how to use the network debugging tab that just kind of goes specifically into how you can debug network traffic, but you can also get a handle on some of that information by just using the symbolic debugger. Now I'm going to basically continue execution because I don't have any more breakpoints set. This should just kind of go back to the main event loop and show me the results in the browser. And you can see here I've now advanced to the point where it actually displays the confirmation dialog box. I can hit OK, and now I'm back to normal behavior of the application. And I can continue to use this, and it'll operate normally until such time as I hit another breakpoint, and then we'll switch back over into the debugger. And anytime you want, as you're moving through your application, you don't have to set up those breakpoints in advance. You can go here into your source code, and let's just choose the accounts page arbitrarily. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here in the mounted event, or lifecycle event, which will be invoked as soon as we go to that accounts page. And I'll just set a breakpoint here, for example, and then go back over here and to see those accounts, I've got to, first of all, sign in. So that I have access to this accounts list. And now when I click through there, immediately I hit that breakpoint, I get bounced back here into the debugger, and I can see actually the specifics of the response that came back from the server. I can look at the data that's there either in this pop-up, or I could switch over to the debug view and could take a look in the response object itself, drill into the data, look at all the details of what came back. Now, this is a super helpful capability to be able to kind of go in and inspect the code as it's executing. That said, there's nothing wrong with throwing in a few console.log statements once in a while to do that printf style debugging. But if you really want to look in detail about what's going on, follow the flow of control, be able to inspect the data as you go, there's no substitute for using a source level debugger like this, and I recommend it to you very highly as a very powerful tool to get your code going correctly.